When you got brothers singing together, it's like having an instrument that nobody else can buy. The Bee Gees, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? It's on HBO Max, and I'm going to talk about it right now. Hey everybody, Chris King here with Love Live Music. Thanks for popping in. If it's your first time, hit the subscribe button. Give me a like. Do something like that. If you like live music, this might not be the place for you. If you love live music, then yeah, you're probably on the right spot. There's not a lot of live music to talk about right now necessarily, so we're talking about some other things in the music world. For instance, HBO Max has just put out the Bee Gees documentary that we've all been waiting for. How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? This is directed by Frank Marshall. At first, I was like, Frank Marshall, that's the guy that did Laverne and Shirley. Nope, Frank Marshall, he's the guy that plays Yoda. Nope, it's neither of those guys. It's Frank Marshall, who along with Kathleen Kennedy is part of Amblin Entertainment, the Steven Spielberg joint. So he's definitely been around for a while, and he's giving us complete access to the long career of the Bee Gees. 3 things that we're not going to learn in this particular documentary. We're not going to learn how the Bee Gees got their name from the brothers Gibb. We can guess, but there was never a light bulb moment of here's why we call ourselves this. They're not going to tell us how disco got its name. And they're also not going to tell us how their chests are so hairy. These cats have some hairy chests, but they are going to give us one revelation that is pretty poignant, and I'm not going to tell you what that is right now. I'm going to tell you here in a little bit. Let's talk about the documentary and the career of the Bee Gees. Hard to believe that they got their band started in 1958. I mean, in my opinion, and I'm a child of the 70s, right? And I remember the Bee Gees from the 70s. Not a whole lot, more towards the end of that decade. When I was 8, 9 years old, that's when I really became aware of these guys are on the radio all the time. But their career started 20-ish years before that, in 1958. They had a couple of hits through the years. They decided that they wanted to be like the Beatles. And from what I understand, their early albums are very Beatles-esque. That's what Noel Gallagher tells us, and he's the one with a fantastic quote there about once you have brothers singing together, that's like an instrument that nobody else can have. Nobody else can buy it. Nobody else can own it. And there's some truth to that. And he should know, right? From his history of singing with his brother. Although I think they probably fought even more than these cats in the Bee Gees. You got Barry Gibb, the older brother with the good hair. And as I watched Barry Gibb through the years, I think, yeah, this is where Russell Brand has gotten a lot of his shtick. And beyond that, when Barry Gibb gets older and Eric Clapton's in this film some, it's amazing how much Barry Gibb and Eric Clapton favor one another. Like those two cats could be brothers. The other brothers, you've got Robin and you got Morris, who, for the life of me, I've always known as Maurice, as in the Pompatus of Love, Maurice. But nope, they refer to him as Morris throughout this film. So, lesson learned. Then, later, we have the younger Gibb. Andy Gibb comes along much later in the film, never really a Bee Gee until right before his death. Spoiler alert. Morris and Robin were twins, and one of them was born 5 minutes before the other. And there is a lot of brotherly friction throughout. So they start their band around 1958. By the end of the 60s, they have a couple of hits. The New York mining disaster song, I believe, was their first hit. And then Robin comes along and with this great song called Massachusetts, and it becomes their first ever hit, number 1 hit in the UK. It's interesting that throughout this, That's the only song of theirs that they actually show being performed twice. At the very end, Ed Sheeran does a version of it from the Bee Gees Grammy Honors performance that would have been in 2017. And then earlier, they show them as they record that song as it's hitting number one. And let me tell you, a lot of the footage throughout this is really fascinating. If you're a fan of the band or if you're a fan of music from that era, particularly when we get to the mid 70s, this is totally worth a watch. It's very interesting how these things have come together and how they've done some things in the studio. We get to meet some members of the band, which, believe it or not, the Bee Gees didn't do it all themselves. They had a drummer. They had a keyboard player that they heisted from Mott the Hoople. They have, they have other guitar players, even though Barry does play guitar a lot throughout, and Morris plays bass throughout. And all in all, we see a lot of the early days leading up to an early point in the 70s where the band breaks up. It's just not happening for them anymore. There's some real friction there as Robin wants to be the front man, Barry wants to be the front man, and really, I hate to say it, but I'm sure if you're familiar with the Bee Gees, you might feel the same way. Robin really had a face for radio, and maybe that's why he was blessed with such a fantastic voice, because if this would have been the video age when they came up, I'm not sure if it would have happened the way that it did. Cut to, they decide to get back together. In 1974, 1975, they go to Miami, where Clapton has had a lot of success doing his most recent album. And they cut a record that starts their gradual movement to global domination. I thought it was very interesting, some of the things that we learned. One thing that we learned is that one of the brothers, I believe it was Morris, said that he had 6 Rolls Royces before he turned 21. That's amazing, considering the time period we're talking about. 6 Rolls Royces before he turned 21. That was just one that I was like, yeah, that clicks for a crazy thing. The other thing that we see is now that they're in Miami, they talk of driving over this bridge that was kind of a clackety bridge to get to the studio. And it reminded me of time in Miami, and there are a lot of bridges over some different waterways there, and that as they were driving over the bridge, the tempo of the clackety as they were going over the bridge is what stuck with them for the guitar syncopation for the first of Jive Talkin'. And I think that that's really, that song, when that came out, is really what spurned them back. And they said, when we pressed that song, when we pressed Jive Talkin', we had to send it out to the radio stations without any names on it. It looked like the White Album from the Beatles. It was completely white. It looked like an acetate with no record label on it, no artist information on it, and that the radio stations immediately started calling up saying, who is this? Who is this? And they found out it was the Bee Gees. And the Bee Gees would go on, I think this was in 1975, and they have a number 1 hit with Jive Talkin'. And that really starts the ball rolling for what's going to happen next. They got another album they're getting ready to make. They're doing a live album, and they need to put it together. And they've decided to go to France to record this live album. And when they get there, they find out the cat that owned the record label, Robert Stigwood. And I've got all these albums, all these singles from the 70s that have RSO inside of a little pig, RSO. And I always wondered what that was. Fast forward to Robert Stigwood Organization, that was their label that they were on. And that guy made the deal to sign John Travolta to a 3-picture deal, which would include Saturday Night Fever, Grease, and something called Moment to Moment that I've never heard of. All that being said, the Bee Gees get to France. They're starting to work on their live album, the Bee Gees Live, whatever it's going to be called. And he calls up and he says, hey, I need some good songs. They send him a tape with like 5 songs that they've been working on in France. And it's Staying Alive. It's Night Fever. It's More Than a Woman. It's How Deep Is Your Love. It's crazy that these guys have written the songs that they've written. It's really, really amazing, the run that they have. Saturday Night Fever comes out. It goes on at its time to be the biggest selling album ever. That's why this is all so fascinating to watch. You get to see a lot of inside scoop on these guys, and they take us through to the end of the disco era. There's a lot of talk about disco starting to lose its steam, and they bring in the big disco sucks riot that happened in Chicago's Comiskey Ballpark, where they blow up and they burn a lot of disco albums. And that's juxtaposed with the fact that the Bee Gees are on a stadium tour. They're playing their own stadium, sold out. And they're literally at Oakland Stadium, and it's showing them, and it keeps cutting back and forth to the disco demolition of Chicago. These cats are playing in Oakland. And the film of when they're playing in Oakland, it looks so good. I mean, I don't know if this is 4K or what, but I want to see that whole concert because it looks like it was filmed today. It's awesome. And I would like to see the whole thing. I know they called up their brother. They got Andy Gibb on stage for a little bit. He's having his own number ones while this whole thing's going on. And as a side note, I did own all 3 Andy Gibb singles when I was a young child, 7, 8 years old. I Just Want to Be Your Everything, Shadow Dancing, Blood is Thicker Than Water. I got them all, baby. So time marches on. Disco starts to fade. And they take a break for a little bit. A couple years later, they decide they want to be big-time songwriters. And that's what they do. They write the big hits for Barbra Streisand. They write the Islands in the Stream, Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton. I'd forgotten that they wrote that. They wrote hits for Diana Ross, for Celine Dion. They really did it all. And throughout their career, showed that you can have a lifelong career in the music business. In the film, we get to see different asides from other popular musicians. Justin Timberlake's there. Chris Martin from Coldplay is there. I told you that Noel from Oasis is interviewed. Eric Clapton is interviewed. It's really for a music fan, particularly a fan of some 70s era pop culture. This is so worth a watch and so worth your time. And, you know, we all know how it ends. It ends with Andy Gibb dies, 1988. Then we've got years later, Morris and Robin die. I think Morris dies in 2002, 2003. Robin dies in 2012. Barry Gibb is still alive. And his interviews are all from modern day. He probably could have picked a better shirt to wear, but that's just, I'm nitpicking. Because Barry Gibb says one of the most interesting things to me. And I wrote it down because at the very end of the film, and this is major spoiler, Barry Gibb says, I'd rather have them all back here and not have any hits at all. And that just really stuck with me, that when it comes down to it, he misses his brothers. They're not here. Forget about all the hits. Forget about all the Rolls Royces. Forget about everything. He just misses his brothers. Look, it was a fantastic hour and 45 minutes. If you've got HBO Max, you got to check it out. And if you love music and you love live music, I appreciate you checking me out. I've got some other videos popping up right now. I'm going to go find some NPR Tiny Desk concerts to watch. As I was told, I need to check out a lot of those, and I'm looking forward to it. My name's Chris King.